Welcome to Barry's In the Interim podcast, where we explore the cutting edge of innovative clinical trial design for the pharmaceutical and medical industries, and so much more. Let's dive in.
All right, welcome everybody back to In the Interim. I'm your host, Scott Barry, and I have a guest today who I'm guessing has spent more time in the interim of clinical trials maybe than anybody. I'm not sure this is something that's ever been tracked. My guest today is Dr. Janet Wittes, and she has spent quite a bit of time in the interim, a little bit different than in this interim. So welcome, Janet.
Thanks, Scott. Looking forward.
Janet is a fellow of the ASA, the Society of Clinical Trials, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She's an elected member of the ISI, past president of the Society of Clinical Trials and the ENAR. She was a recipient of the Janet L. Norwood Award from the Women in Statistical Sciences and the W.J. Dixon Consulting Award for the American Statistical Association. So, and she has a very long history of clinical trials and a very fun history. So let's maybe start, Janet, if you will, of how did you become a statistician?
Oh, my father was a chemist, and so I figured I would just follow in my father's footsteps. But I majored in biochemistry because I was an undergraduate at Radcliffe, which doesn't exist anymore. My husband keeps on teasing me, your college went out of business. So for those of you who don't know, Radcliffe was the women's part of Harvard. And in the biochemistry department had a really good feature. You got a tutor. And the tutors were very senior faculty members. And so that was a big advantage of biochemistry over chemistry. And my tutor was John Edsel, who was a biochemist, protein chemist. And I would go, it was very clear to him, I would go every week and he'd give me something to read. And it was very clear to him two things. One, that I didn't really understand what I was reading. I always got things right on an exam because that was just figuring out what the professor would ask. But when he asked me deep questions, I couldn't answer. And he also realized I just wasn't good in the lab. And so he was trying to figure out, which was really decent of him, what I'd be interested in. And in the beginning, he gave me books and things to read in biochemistry and chemistry, and I didn't like them. Then he gave me J. Willard Gibbs's The Phase Rule. And that's a fabulous, really interesting description of matter. And what's fascinating is there's a point in temperature and pressure where molecules are in three phases. They're at the same time solid, liquid, and gas. And I thought that was really fascinating. Interestingly enough, later on, and I didn't know this at the time, later on he won the Willard Gibbs Award in 1972 afterwards. So he must have really liked that book a lot. Anyhow, so he was intrigued by that I suddenly was interested in something. And then he gave me The Fitness of the Environment by Henderson. And that talked about things that were really, again, really interesting. Why is it that we have life? Part of the reason is that water, that H2O, when it's solid, is lighter than when it's liquid. Whereas most solids are heavier. Most molecules are heavier when they're... So I found that really fascinating. And then you could see when I went there that he just trying to figure out what it was that got me excited. And he said, I have a book you might like. And it was Facts from Figures by Moroni. And I read about a half a chapter and I said, this is what I want to do. And I came back and I said, I'm so excited and thank you very much. And I switched into math. And that's why I got into statistics.
Yeah. So you did an interview with Scott Evans several years ago in Chance, and it was wonderful. And I think in there you described it that you were more interested in how they made the inferences than what the inference was itself.
Yeah, I couldn't care what an experiment showed. It just didn't interest me. But how they made the conclusion, I found really fascinating. And I remember in Fitness of the Environment, there was these little footnotes with P's at the bottom. And I asked him, what are these little P things? And he explained to me what they were. And I thought that was really interesting. So this was a lesson for me in a really good professor, being able to figure out what interested somebody and then match her up with a field.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. So from there, so Radcliffe University, you get your degree.
Radcliffe College.
I'm sorry, Radcliffe College. You get your degree at that point, and you described that it was probably very strange for the time that you were expected to go to graduate school from your family. It was just being a woman, being at that time, probably very unusual.
Yes, it was unusual because my father didn't understand how intelligent women didn't get PhDs. So he insisted that my mother get a PhD in psychology. His grandparents, his grandmother had gone to medical school in Poland. She wasn't allowed to practice, so she became a licensed midwife, but she was basically the physician. Her two daughters, who came here when they were, one was about 15 and one was about 18, they became dentists. And so there was an expectation that everybody would go to graduate school. And so it was not, it was nothing unexpected in my family.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you go to Harvard at that point for your graduate program. And you're the only female in your class.
Yes, there were 10 of us. I was the only woman.
Yeah.
There were some other women that were a couple of years older than I was. And later on, there were many women. But actually, I will tell you this story. This is not in the interview, but it was very clear to me that people spent their first 2 years in classes, and then their third year, everybody was looking for thesis. In the Harvard department then, you didn't get assigned a thesis topic. You found one. And I thought, well, this doesn't make sense to spend a year doing nothing except looking for a thesis. I'll go work. And I went to the chair and I said, I want to take a year off. And he opened his drawer. He had the bottom drawer of his desk, and he took his finger, and there were a bunch of files, and he said, these are the women that I have accepted. And then he pulled one file folder out, and he said, and this is the woman who has finished. That was Janet Dixon. And he said, I don't want you to take a year off. You will never come back. And I was furious. I said, you can't not let me take a year off, and I hope you let me back in. So I did take a year off. I found a thesis when I was away, which is what I expected. I worked at the Mass General and for Victor Seidel on safety. So that was, how do you deal with safety issues in clinical studies? And I found a thesis that was capture recapture.
Wow. And afterwards, you then went to work for Jerry Cornfield. Do I have the sequence correct here?
Yes. When I graduated, so this was during Vietnam. So Bob, who had gone to medical school, he had to serve something in Vietnam in those days, and his service was to go to the NIH. And there was a whole bunch of people. They were called Yellow Berets, and they went to the Indian Health Service and to NIH, and he went to the National Cancer Institute. So I was looking for position. I had 2 babies at the time that was half-time, but in statistics. And somebody, Jerry Cornfield wrote to somebody, I'm looking for a half-time assistant. And so we connected, and that was wonderful. I learned so much from him and had such a good time. He was, he's very, very inventive and very smart and very nice. And so it was 2 years of Bayes.
Yeah, I was going to say he's also a long history of Bayes in that. Interestingly, it's not an uncommon question I ask of whether people are Bayesian or not, but was that sort of your first experience? Did you have anything at Harvard in Bayesian? And was this ever a decision to be Bayesian, non-Bayesian at that time?
No, it wasn't his decision at all. It was at Harvard, there were 2 sides of the river. There was the Cambridge side, which was mostly frequentists, and there was the Boston side, the business school, which was Bayesian. And on our Tuesday seminars, the Bayesian crowd would come over, and there would be all kinds of arguments. So that was, but I never took a class in Bayes. And when I went to Jerry, I wrote him a letter that said something about, I've grown up frequentist, but if you can convert me, I'm willing to be converted. So I was open to it, but not wedded. I mean, if it had been, I wanted to work with Jerry. Whatever he happened to be doing would be fine.
And you did this, you did the work. Interesting. I think an important part of it was, and then maybe leading into what your first job after that, as well, was the importance of being able to spend time with your children, which is sort of interesting nowadays where this has become such an important thing. In some ways, this, even back then, it's such a interesting era of women working and all of that, but that was an incredibly important part of this for you.
Oh, absolutely. And it was a juggle. It was always a juggle. How do you bring up kids and work? And so when my job in New York, I first spent a couple of years at Columbia at the Department of Epidemiology. It was half-time. And then I got a position at Hunter, the math department. And that was really wonderful for me because I got to teach, but because there were classes at night, I could teach at night and be with the kids during the day. And then when I got tenure, the women that I was with at the playground, because I was always at the playground, said, "How do you get tenure when you're only part-time?" And I said, no, I'm full-time, but you see me in the day, but I work at night. And it was a great place to be. The students were from the city, from all 5 boroughs, and very dedicated. I used to bring the kids to school with me when I had to, and they'd play in the halls. And then when I had a third baby, I would bring the baby, and the students would come and babysit because that was very interesting to them that you could bring your kids. And then later on, the guys in the department would bring their kids. Mm. So it was really friendly and nice, and I'm still in touch with some of the students from those days.
Wow. Now, interestingly, so you were there 8 years, I think. Were you starting your work in clinical trials, and was the Women's Health Initiative something you were doing there, or did that come after?
That came after.
Okay.
The clinical trials, I had some relation to clinical trials when I was at Hunter. I worked a little bit with my husband, who was at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and so I did a little, but mostly I was teaching. And so the Women's Health Initiative actually came quite a bit later. So I was I got a call from NHLBI asking me to apply to be the branch chief of the biostatistics research branch, and I thought it was a joke. I figured, they must want some women to apply, and I wasn't even going to respond. And I was in bed that night. I said to Bob, I got a call from NHLBI, and they asked me to apply to this job. And he said, "What did you say?" I said, "No." He said, "You did what?" I said, "It was just a joke. They're not going to hire me." He said, "Just say you're interested in applying." And he was very interested in a specific job at MCI. So if I had gotten this, he would have followed me. And mirabile dictu, I got the position. So I was absolutely overwhelmed and thrilled. The first day, I remember it as the first day. It may not be the first day, but, memory has a way of making... I come in, and Gordon Lamb and Kent Bailey come up to me, and they say, "You're the branch chief. You can go to any DSMB that you want to. You should go to everyone." So for 7 years, I went to every DSMB that was held for most of the contracts, but there was some grants by NHLBI. So that's where I learned about clinical trials. The WHI happened later because after I left, I got a call asking me to be on the DSMB. And I had just started a company and I was tired, and I said, I just don't have the time. I said, no. So the next day or a little later, I met Bill Harlan, who had been the person to whom I'd reported before I left. He said, "Janet, why did you say no? I want you to do it." I said, "Okay, Bill, if you want me to do it, I'll do it." And then the next day he called me. He said, "As long as you're going to do it, why don't you chair it?" I said, "Okay." Yep. So that's how I got involved.
Interesting. So from Hunter College, you're starting to do some stuff, and then you get asked to be the branch chief of biostatistics at NHLBI. At what point in this do you consider yourself a biostatistician? It may not have been title, but at what point do you decide that's what I love doing and I'm a biostatistician?
Okay.
The day you went to DC, you became a biostatistician?
No.
Yeah.
It added back to my first fellowship. So I had real troubles in my department. My department chair was not good to me. And so I didn't get any money from the department. Everybody else did. So I went to there was an office of the Public Health Service. And I went to that office. And I said, "I've got into graduate school and I want to go, and do you have any scholarships?" And he gave me this great big, seemed like 100-page application for a fellowship. And I said, "Don't you have anything shorter?" So he pulls out a 1-page thing, a traineeship. He said, "Well, this is another." So I said, "Oh, okay, I'll apply for that." But the deal was you had to agree to go into public health. So I said, "Okay, I'll go into public health." And then I ended up taking a lot of courses at the biostat department at the School of Public Health. And that's why. And I got interested. I mean, it wasn't as...
Right.
So it was a really good fit. But if that piece of paper had been bigger, I probably would have been in a different field.
Yeah, fantastic. So I guess tying a few things together, interesting. So your family, and you referred to your father and really your family that expected graduate school and chemistry. What about your own children? So you three kids. Did any of them go into statistics?
No, nobody went into statistics. Nobody went into medicine. Nobody went into science. All right. Yep. So my daughter majored in basically comp lit, French and English. My son, Ben, whom a lot of you may know, he does national security law, and he's very active politically. He majored in English and Japanese history, modern Japanese history, and my son Jeremy majored in Spanish. So,
wow, yeah, very, very liberal arts from coming from that. That's fantastic.
yeah.
Okay, so you're at the NHLBI within that. And I think you spend a year in New Haven and all of that. And then you decide to start a business. And I don't know so much if it was a decision to start a business so much as I'm consulting. I love what I'm doing. I'm designing clinical trials. I need a business to do this kind of thing. So how does that happen? What's that process?
Okay, so I come back from our disastrous year in New Haven. My job at NHLBI, it was 1 year. August 15th to August 15th. Bob goes back to the NCI. My job is gone. And he says to me, oh, and I get a lot of offers from different people. They call me up, you're coming back, why don't you do this? But nothing was as I mean, I left a tenure position at Hunter. This is now 8 years later, and I'm getting these offers to work for free for all sorts of stuff. And I'm saying, something here isn't computing. So Bob says, look, just spend your time. You've got all these half-written papers. We've moved twice in a year. Just write your papers, and something will happen. So I say, okay. So not very long after that, I mean, again, my sense of time is not accurate, but certainly I hadn't finished a paper yet. Okay. So I get a call from Jerry Sadoff, who's the head of immunology at Walter Reed. And I had known him from my NHLBI days because I had sat on a meningococcemia, a sepsis study that he was one of the PIs of. And he calls me up and he says, Janet, you're unemployed, which was true. He said, how would you like to learn about malaria? And I said, oh, that sounds interesting. So he then says, he describes the study that he has. He needs some analysis. And he says, how much would you charge? I said, $3,000. Long pause. And he says, would $25,000 be enough? I said, yeah, sure. Then it turned out nobody knew who I was at the Army. It was like, Jerry's friend wants to do this. So they had to do a competitive bid. The next higher bid was 80. So I got it at 25. 80 was much more realistic.
But you were an order of magnitude different than your initial bid. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I had no idea. And that was how the business worked. In fact, and then I got, people, why malaria? Nobody was interested in malaria. It only killed 1 million people a year, right? Yeah. Nobody cared. And by nobody, I mean drug companies didn't care, researchers didn't care. So there was malaria, and then with the Army, there was dengue, there was leishmania. I mean, all these tropical diseases that are really devastating, that where there's very little interest, or at least there was very little interest by the drug companies. So, and I said to Jerry at one point, why do you study these diseases? And he said, we study diseases everywhere our boys might go. So they were basically scientists who were in the Army. And when they found a disease they were interested in, our boys might go there. So that was fascinating. And so we worked in trials, developing vaccine trials. That was developing vaccine trials for all those 3 diseases. And then the other thing that happened, there were other diseases nobody cared about, or they didn't study. One was ALS, because nothing worked. So, and there was no, at that point, there wasn't a group of statisticians that worked in ALS. So there were a bunch of these diseases that were orphan diseases that people didn't care about. And by care about, I mean there was no formal structure to study these diseases in the way there was for cancer and hearts.
Yep.
And so I kept on getting these orphan diseases. And malaria is an orphan disease, even though it kills 1 million people. Not anymore. It kills like 1,000 a year. But it's an orphan disease because orphan disease status is defined by the cases in the U.S. So I began getting these, and nobody in heart came to me. That's the only thing I knew about. Nobody came because there was a whole structure in cardiology. Nobody in cancer came, or I wouldn't take anything in cancer because Bob was so high up at the NCI that it would be unseemly for me to do. And also I didn't know anything about cancer. So I built this business, and and my two older kids were just graduating from college. So I hired one of them, and I hired their friends. We called it the Kid Connection, and that was how the business started. It was if anybody had told me 10 years before that I would start a business, I would have just laughed because I love teaching and I loved working in the government.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So you spent time, a significant time, 8 years academia, 9 years in government, and then early 1990s, you start Statistics Collaborative, and that goes for 30 years, essentially.
Yeah, 32 years, yeah.
Yeah, but doing this consulting, building the business in that. And hence, I stick with the comment, as you described NHLBI, that you have probably spent more time in the interim than anybody in the world. It's fantastic. How do you think of the sort of current world of clinical trials, statistical science, adaptive designs? And I know you've been on DSMBs for trials we've designed, and you've seen kind of a lot of things. Let's ignore the recent political aspects of this, but just the science of it. We'll get to the political aspect, but the science of this and where we are.
Well, I think we're in exciting times. And if you had asked me this 5 years ago, I would have said, I think we're in exciting times. Right? But, and actually, I read my interview just this morning, and I realized that one of the things I said, and that was 11 years ago, is that we're going to have to think about cell therapy, we're going to have to about gene therapy. And I realized that was actually prescient. I think there are, big data and AI and all the things that are making studies different from what they used to be. It's pretty exciting, and I think people should realize that, you hear things about, there's no more clinical trials. That's not true. There's going to be plenty of clinical trials. The shape is going to change. And how you think about, there's a lot of trials in super orphan diseases. How do you deal with those? Those are really different. I mean, I was used to vaccine trials, thousands of people, and you count the number of events, or cardiology trials where there used to be hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands. You're now dealing with really tiny sample sizes. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with genetic variants? So I think there's a wealth of interesting, exciting, difficult issues that we're facing.
That's fantastic. So part of this picture a little bit is sort of when we were setting up the timing of this, you referred to how busy you are. So you're still doing tons of statistics for sure. You're also quite an advocate. You're getting involved in social things. And interesting, while we're taping this, RFK Jr. is in front of Congress. We've got things. You're passionate about this now.
Yeah. So I'm silent because I feel so strongly that RFK Jr. is doing serious harm to the country as a whole, to the world as a whole, by his anti-vaccine stance. And it's really scary. Florida just yesterday, or 2 days ago, removed the mandate for school kids to take vaccines. And what does that mean? Suddenly we're going to have polio again? Suddenly we already have measles again. We're going to have diphtheria again. So suddenly, and I feel because I worked in vaccines so much, it hits me, it hits all of us very strongly. It hits us as parents, it hits us as residents. If you think about people who are immunocompromised, kids who are immunocompromised going to school, why did they get protected? They got protected not because they got vaccines, they couldn't, but because of their herd immunity, because everybody else was vaccinated against these diseases. So yeah, I think we as a community of citizens have to fight this in whatever way we can.
Yeah, I mean, your view of working with people like Jerry Cornfield and the work he did, and the NHLBI, and the amazing strides we've made in health since you started there and all that, and now it just seems incredible. And interestingly, you said that you're preparing to go on and march and protest this weekend, so you're very, very active.
Well, I'm not as active as I would like to be, but I am. So my brother is coming in from Connecticut for this march. So the issue here in D.C. is that the National Guard has come to protect us from marauding bands. So I've actually spoken to 3 groups of these National Guards, one at the Union Station, one at DuPont Circle, and one when I was on my way to the gym. And I've said to them, basically, go home. We don't need you. We don't want you. Go. We support our police. They're protecting us. So it's very scary living in a police state because you just go for a walk and you see the National Guard all over. So my brother's coming in from Connecticut, and he's made me a poster. He painted it. It's Humpty Dump with Trump as Humpty Dumpty sitting on a wall, and he has a hat with the quote from Rahm Emanuel, cruel, chaotic, corrupt. And so that's going to be my T-shirt. What does this do? No, but I do think we individually have to do lots and lots of little things to make the politicians realize that we care and that they are not protecting us by rolling over and doing everything that Trump says. Yeah.
And it's interesting if you go back to the huge part about RFK, about the health, and your original interest in statistics was the process of learning, inferences, and a little bit less about the chemical interpretation of that, but the process of that. And that's sort of at assault right now. Is this process of understanding is gone, and it's just what somebody wants as the decision, and this whole process of science is leaving this. Interestingly, what else is a bit of at assault is diversity. And you recently wrote a short little interesting article on diversity. Be interesting to tell our audience about that.
Okay, so this was written in Lilith magazine, which was founded by my friend Susan Schneider. She's just retiring after 50 years. It's a feminist Jewish magazine. And she had me write a little piece. So I was working, this was when I was 19. So it was after my sophomore or junior year of college. And I was working at General Foods, a summer job. And I was working in the market research department, which was, very statistical. And they were really interested in the following problem. They were interested in why they can't sell SOS in Jewish neighborhoods. They had done all kinds of market research that showed that the higher the percentage of Jews, the less SOS was sold. And they invited me to a meeting with some very senior people at the company. This is General Foods, and I view them as all 6 feet tall, very handsome, with suits.
Were you invited in your role, or were you invited because you were Jewish?
Oh, no, I don't think they knew I was Jewish. If they'd known I was Jewish, they probably wouldn't have hired me. No, they invited me because my boss thought it would be good for me to see how decisions were made. And so I was sitting around the table, and they were all talking about all the different things they did. They advertised in Jewish newspapers. They had Molly Goldberg from the television program advertise SOS. And I finally said, but you're never going to sell it in Jewish neighborhoods. And they looked at me and they said, I don't know what they said. And I said, the soap isn't kosher. There's a dead silence. And one of them says, there's such a thing as kosher soap. I said, yes. Yeah. So it was a dual lesson. It was a lesson in diversity. That it was a lesson that you have to have representation of people that things that are relevant. And it was also a lesson for me in that models aren't enough. You have to understand the context. There's a little piece left of the story that I wrote in my piece. I was invited the next year to lunch at Oscar Hamlin's house. And I was very nervous about being there. He was a very, very, very prominent sociologist in immigration. And I was really timid, and I'm there. And the person who had invited me said, tell your story about General Foods. So I told my story. And Oscar Hamlin said, serves them right for not hiring Jews. But it really is, as we're becoming less and less open to hearing from people from all different stripes, we're going to, not only are individual people going to be heard, but information isn't going to be parlayed.
Yeah, it's an incredible story from the perspective of they had gotten to this point. They're trying to increase sales in Jewish neighborhoods. They're running marketing studies, marketing campaigns, and they haven't talked to a Jew at that point, I imagine, which is sort of stunning in that. I love how you tied that to the role of you as a scientist, where you might be now working on a trial in ALS and malaria, cardiovascular, and your role is not just as a modeler, but understanding the science, understanding the context, and you're a better scientist under that perspective. I imagine that has to be part of your story.
Oh, yes. I mean, so I've done a lot of work in diseases in Africa, right? These diseases and one of the things I felt was really important was to go to the clinics. And you go to a clinic and in, let's say, Kenya, and you go to a hospital and you realize, oh my goodness, it's very different from hospitals here. People are coming from far away, walking with their babies and their food and sitting in sitting in the halls. And then you look at the hospital beds, there are 20 people in a room. And so if you don't have a sense of, oh my goodness, what is it like to have a hospital? How can you design a study without knowing the physical context of what you're doing? So yeah, so it's not only the science of it, how does the protozoa work in malaria, but it is how can you actually do a study in a place that is so different from what we're used to.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. Well, Janet, thank you for joining us in the interim, a place you're comfortable with, and good luck this weekend.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to it. I hope we can do something. Thanks so much, Scott, for inviting me. And I do have to say, I do enjoy sitting on your DSMBs. They're always interesting and very different from other ones.
Fabulous. I hope you'll come back and tell us about all the other stuff you're doing, because we love to do multiple interims here.
Okay.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Janet.
Bye-bye.